Hello, my name is Mattie Mae, and I am presenting on my thesis, Spiders in a Window, How Dangerous Stories Lead to Dangerous Women. My thesis focuses on a 2nd century apocryphal story called The Acts of Paul and Thecla. The main character, Thecla, abandons her fiancé, her mother, and her way of life to pursue the gospel. I have to admit, when I first heard about this story, I felt a little bit cheated. Why had I not ever heard this story before? I grew up in the church, I was a Christian, I loved church history. Why did I never get the chance to hear about this? I also resonated with this story on a personal level because in high school, I was called to ministry. Except, being raised in a Southern Baptist culture, when I was raised to ministry, I was immediately faced with the limitations of my calling. I was told that I could be a youth pastor, not a head pastor. I was told that I could be a children's minister or a women's minister, but not actually teach men. I was uncomfortable with these limitations because I had trouble reconciling them with the fact that the Bible actually encourages women in ministry. From what I had read, women like Priscilla and Mary Magdalene and Hagar and Miriam, they all inspired me growing up. These were women like me, and God called them and used them despite any limitations that other people might have put on them because they were women. And so I had trouble reconciling the fact that people thought that my being a woman was limiting what God could do in my life. So when I read the story of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, I related to Thecla because she was a woman just like me. She was a young girl, and she left everything to pursue the calling of Christ, even though that calling meant going against her own expectations as a woman. In fact, this story was so influential that Tertullian, an early church father and very important leader in the early church, came out with a statement publishing the fact that he did not endorse the Acts of Paul and Thecla because of the inspiration the story had, the impact that the story had. And that impact and that inspiration, according to his own writing, was that women were reading this story and they were inspired, like me, to go baptize and be missionaries on the mission field. This, of course, was astonishing for its time, a time in which women were oppressed in many ways, and they were viewed as objects more than anything else. This story told women that God wanted them and God could use them, and it was circulated so widely that Thecla became a beacon of hope for these women. And so, because I'm assuming you, like me, have not heard this story, I wanted to go ahead and summarize the story for you. It is really fun, and so I really encourage you to go read it yourself. But here's my short summary. Thecla was a young girl in the town of Iconium when she was sitting in her bedroom window and she heard Paul, the Apostle Paul, teaching from her neighbor's home. She was so enthralled by Paul's teaching that she sat and listened to him for 3 days. She didn't move. All she wanted to do was listen to the gospel. This, of course, disturbed her mother and her fiancé, so much so that her mother compared her to a spider in a window. Someone who was completely enthralled, someone who was completely paralyzed because of the gospel. Her fiancé, of course, was a little bit angered by this, and so he went to the town leaders and turned in Paul. As soon as Thecla learned that Paul was imprisoned, she went to his prison cell and she sat with him all night listening to his teachings. The next day, the guard found her, and he was very disturbed by this. So he ended up imprisoning Thecla as well as Paul. But when it came time for their verdict, Paul was let go, and Thecla, at the request of her own mother, was sentenced to death at the stake. So she was led to the stake, but God delivered her. He sent a storm and killed everyone around her except for her, and delivered her from that death sentence. As soon as she was delivered, she went and found Paul, and she begged him to please let her go on the missionary journeys with him. At first, he was like, no. Actually, and his reasoning was that she would be a temptation to him and the other people on the mission because she was a woman. Well, she didn't take this as an answer, nor should any woman. And so she continued to beg Paul, and he finally relented and let her accompany them to the town of Myra, the next town. So in the town of Myra, Paul and Thecla encounter the emperor. And the emperor decides that he really likes Thecla and he wants to sleep with her. Except Thecla thinks this is ridiculous, and so she decides to knock the crown off of his head and rip his royal robes. Of course, the emperor doesn't like this, and Paul completely denies her, so she is sentenced to the Colosseum, where she will have to fight wild beasts to the death. Her only wish, however, is that she would be able to remain a virgin until the end of her life. And so an older woman in the community volunteered to take Thecla into her home until the games to preserve her chastity until her death. This woman happened to be very rich and influential in the town, and she also happened to have just lost a daughter. So she decides to adopt Thecla as her own daughter, and Thecla actually converts her to Christianity in the process. Well, long story short, Thecla ends up going into the Colosseum to face her death. Except God has a different plan. He wants her to be a part of his mission, so he divinely intervenes. So as Thecla is getting ready to face off these wild beasts, God sends a lioness to protect her. The lioness immediately enters the Colosseum and lays at her feet and starts licking her toes like a house cat. Of course, this is really surprising to the entire crowd, but then it gets even cooler. The lioness actually fights for her, and she kills not only the other lion, but all of the other beasts in the arena. But however, the lioness ends up sacrificing herself in the process. So, of course, the emperor is really annoyed by this, and so he sends a vat of electric eels for Thecla to be thrown into. However, she sees this vat of water with electric eels in it, and she decides that it's the perfect opportunity to baptize herself. So she gets into the vat full of electric eels and baptizes herself in the middle of a Colosseum with thousands of people as her witness. And when she's done baptizing herself, the electric eels float to the surface dead. God, to cover her nakedness and to protect her from the other beasts that they unleashed in the Colosseum, covers her in fire so nobody is able to kill her. So all of the women in the Colosseum decide to band together. They throw perfumes into the arena to put the animals to sleep. So not only is she covered in fire, but all of the other animals are lulled to sleep by the women who are witnessing this. Finally, the emperor's like, okay, who are you? And why can't I kill you? And Thecla stands in the arena, and Thecla answers in the following way. She says, I am a handmaid of the living God. As to what I have about me, I have believed in him in whom God is well pleased, his son. For his sake, not one of the beasts touched me. For he alone is the goal of salvation and the foundation of immortal life. To the storm-tossed he is a refuge, to the oppressed relief, to the despairing shelter. In a word, whoever does not believe in him shall not live, but die forever. Hearing this, the emperor decides to relent her to her new adopted mother, and Thecla ends up converting the entire town. However, when she's done with this, she's not satisfied. She still wants to find Paul and receive his blessing. And this time, she will not let him use the excuse that she's a temptation. So she decides to shave her head and wear men's clothes in order to avoid being a temptation to him. So she finally finds him, and he's like, whoa, God really does want to use you. And so he gives her his blessing, and she goes out and lives the rest of her days spreading the gospel. And so obviously this story is very cool, and it's very interesting to me, the agency of the women in the story. In my thesis, I look at the different possible genres and therefore the different possible intents that the author had for this story. And basically I conclude that I feel uncomfortable applying a feminist agenda onto this text because the feminist agenda did not exist yet. Actually, it was not even a fleeting thought. So I feel uncomfortable making it into something it's not, and it's into something that it definitely was never meant to be. However, I think it is really crazy how the author puts women in this light, that they are holy, that they have access to God's will, that a lioness can defeat a lion, and that it's also interesting to me that Paul is barely a character in this story that's called the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Some of the scholars I read noted that it should be called the Acts of Thecla because she's the story. It's about her. Paul's character actually acts more as an obstacle to her ministry than a catalyst to it. She hears the gospel from him, but then he continuously denies her access to his missionary journeys, and then leaves her hanging with both of her sentences to death. And so it's interesting that this story that was supposedly written to Paul and for Paul actually puts Paul in kind of, let's say, in an unflattering light. And so in my thesis, I talk about the treatment of women in this story and how, even though it's not feminist, in my opinion, it is revolutionary in the way that women are treated, especially Christian women. The author of this story clearly thinks that women have something to offer the church and something to offer for the mission field in general. In the next chapter, I talk briefly about the Thecla's metamorphosis from an apostle to a saint and what that looks like and what that means. As Thecla's character develops, she becomes declared a saint because of her miracles and God's divine intervention in her life. However, when she becomes a saint, her inspiration becomes less about her ministry and more about her virginity. And I talk about the way that we tell stories is very important. And what we don't include in a story and what we do include in a story actually has a huge effect on the overall reception of that story. Basically, I make the argument that when she became a saint, people started to focus more on the fact that she left her fiancé to preserve her virginity than the reason why she left. It becomes more about her preserving her chastity than it did becoming a missionary. And this all has to do with how they told her story and how they spread that story. It's really interesting to me that Thecla's character and her legacy and her reception changes throughout history as emphasis becomes more on what the overall church thinks a woman should look like. One that is submissive, one that has very little agency. And virginity has a lot to do with that. I also talk about the reason why they started focusing on things like that, on things like virginity and chastity in stories. I also focus on why we start to tell stories about women being virgins, why we start emphasizing their chastity instead of their agency. And so I just wanted to read this excerpt from my thesis, which I really think synthesizes this argument better than I'm doing right now. It says, perhaps the church did not realize the effect these stories, like the Acts of Paul and Thecla, would have on the lives of actual Christian women. Perhaps they did not expect women to pursue holiness, independence, and spiritual equality with such zeal. It is clear that Thecla's story and other stories like hers had a dangerous and unwanted effect on the women who heard it. This effect allowed for women to resist and challenge the men around them. For Thecla, all it took was hearing a sermon from her bedroom window, and she began to pursue holiness at all costs, even to the point of defying the men in her life. All it takes is a dangerous story to make a dangerous woman. And so that leads me to my conclusion. It's really hard to synthesize a 60-page paper into a 15-minute presentation, and so I hope this makes sense. If you want to read it, please email me. I would be glad to send you a copy. But basically my conclusion is how we tell our stories and who we tell our stories and what stories we're telling, they matter. And the fact that I had never heard of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, that matters. And it doesn't matter whether Thecla was a historical figure, because there's not really any basis for that. But it does matter that her legacy had such an impact on women that they realized, or that they started looking at their ministry in such a way that was freeing, not limiting to them. In my final chapter, I talk about not only studying Thecla's life, but also getting the opportunity to study Thecla's way of life through my interview with Sister Ederlin in Venice, Italy. Sister Ederlin was she still is, a Filipino nun in a Venetian convent that I had the immense pleasure of sitting down with and having a conversation with her. She, like Thecla, completely abandoned her life and what people expected for her life to completely dedicate it to the gospel. And hearing her perspective and hearing her story really impacts this thesis in such a way that it's not just fiction. It's not just people like Thecla. If she is fiction, if she is historical, there are actual people like this in our lives who are dedicating everything to God. And these people are women, and their call does not have anything to do with their gender. And Sister Ederlin, she does not let her gender affect the call that she has felt from God. And I also talk about how really the fact that the church has oppressed women is a tradition that we have held on to. And it's not a church tradition. This is a global tradition, the global tradition that women are inferior to men. It's all throughout history. It's in every culture, including ours still today. It is there. It's just very odd to me that our denomination is so focused on sola scriptura, but we have latched onto this tradition that women are inferior to men when it's not biblical. And so I just wanted to read my conclusion to you, kind of with that tradition and the fact that I want a new tradition and how I think we can start a new tradition. So this is my conclusion. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Please let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to email me. I would love to hear from you. This is it. The Acts of Paul and Thecla inspired early Christian women to imagine a whole new realm of possibilities for their role in ministry. If Thecla could leave everything behind and dedicate her life to the gospel and mission of Jesus Christ, why couldn't other women? If God chose Thecla, a young girl from Iconium sitting in her bedroom window, why couldn't other girls be chosen? Whether Thecla was historical, a legend, or even a protagonist in a novel, her story had the power to provoke questions about the way things were. Indeed, Thecla was no different than the rest of us. She was no one until she encountered the gospel, and she was no one until she decided to abandon everything and everyone to shamelessly pursue Christ without any regard for the expectations of her sex. No one could keep her from living according to her call. Not her mother, her fiancé, nor the emperor, and not even her own spiritual mentor, Paul. The Acts of Paul and Thecla was so important not because of its historical or theological accuracy, but because of its historical and theological implication. The implication that women have so much more to offer in roles of church leadership, biblical studies, and global ministry. As a church, we must put an end to the widespread oppression of women. This oppression stems from the ancient tradition that women are less human than men, and therefore less holy. This leads Christian men, self-proclaimed godly men, to discount, to ignore, to suppress, and even to abuse women. The Bible does not allow for this behavior. It is crucial for the church to relinquish this tradition. If the church does not allow women to contribute fully to the body of Christ, the church will never be whole, and it will never be God's will for his people. I believe the first step to a cure for Christian misogyny is also the first step to writing a new tradition, a tradition that requires women as crucial members of the body of Christ. The church must circulate and encourage dangerous stories. Tradition is cultivated and developed through stories. If Christians were to encourage stories of strong women who are emboldened by the gospel to do impossible things, there would be a shift towards a tradition in which little girls would be free to imagine their divine calling within any context, whether it be behind the pulpit, on the mission fields, the author of biblical commentaries. In order to encourage this new way of thinking and to demand the respect women deserve, we must not shy away from stories like those of Sister Ederlyn, Lottie Moon, or Thecla. The only way to write a new tradition is to read, cultivate, and spread a new narrative, one in which women are permitted to enter the picture. This is the danger in a dangerous story, the women who are inspired by them. These are the women who will rise up and demand a seat at the table. The women who will not allow men to dictate their calling from God. Women like Esther, Jael, Ruth, Mary Magdalene, Phoebe, Priscilla, Thecla, and women like me. Then and only then will the church be prepared to open its doors to the women who have always been waiting at the threshold, the women who sit and listen like spiders in a window. If we allow dangerous stories to transform the way we live and worship, this new tradition can and will revolutionize Christianity as we know it. Thank you.